Landlord evicts black woman, then discovers her father owns the building. Mia's hands shook as she inserted her key into the lock, the metal scraping against brass with an irritating screech. The eviction notice, now crumpled in her designer bag, seemed to carry the weight of every discriminatory slight she'd faced since moving into the building. The apartment had been her haven, her first real step toward independence after landing her job at the consulting firm. Now, like so many spaces before it, it was becoming another battleground. A soft knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Jennifer Torres, her neighbor from 4B, stood in the hallway, concern etched across her features. The young single mother balanced her toddler on her hip, dark circles under her eyes testament to long nights of working and parenting alone. "I saw the notice," Jennifer said quietly, bouncing her fussy daughter. "You're not the only one. Carter's been on a rampage lately." She glanced down the hallway, lowering her voice. Last week, he told Mrs. Chen in 2A that her cooking odors were lowering property values. The week before that, he hassled the Rodriguez family about having too many visitors. Mia invited Jennifer inside, her mind racing as she processed this information. Her apartment, usually a picture of organized calm with its carefully curated art pieces and sleek furniture, suddenly felt vulnerable. The space she'd made her own over the past 2 years could be stripped away by one man's prejudices. "He's trying to clean up the building," Jennifer continued, settling her daughter with a few crayons and paper at Mia's pristine coffee table. That's what he told the new maintenance guy. Said he had plans for the property that required a different class of tenant. Her fingers made air quotes around Carter's words, her disgust evident. Mia moved to her home office, pulling up her banking records on her laptop. Every rent payment was there, documented with timestamps and confirmation numbers. She'd even set up automatic payments specifically to avoid any possibility of late fees or missed deadlines. Her finger traced down the screen, each transaction a bullet point in her defense. "Look at this," she called to Jennifer. "Every payment, on time, in full. He's not even trying to be subtle about his real motives." She began taking screenshots, organizing them into a folder labeled Eviction Defense. Years of preparing client presentations had taught her the value of meticulous documentation. Jennifer's daughter toddled over, proudly showing Mia a crayon drawing. "House," she declared, pointing to a wobbly rectangle. The simple childhood artwork struck a chord. This wasn't just about Mia's home, but about every family in the building facing Carter's discriminatory tactics. "I'm calling legal aid," Mia announced, already pulling up their number. "This isn't just about me anymore. We need to document everything he's doing, every interaction, every comment." She paused, a memory surfacing. Remember last month when he started taking photos of the Kai clutter in the hallway? It was only outside certain apartments, wasn't it?" Jennifer nodded, recognition dawning. "Yes, he made a big show of photographing Miguel's bike, but said nothing about the Brooks kids leaving their scooters out all week." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her own photos. "I started taking pictures too, after he threatened to fine me for my daughter's stroller in the hallway." The sound of voices in the corridor drew their attention. Through the peephole, Mia watched in disbelief as Carter led a young white couple past her door, his voice carrying clearly. "This unit will be available at the end of the month. Complete renovation planned. Hardwood floors, stainless appliances, really upgrading the whole building, making it more suitable for professionals." Mia's hand clenched around her phone, knuckles whitening. The audacity of showing her occupied apartment, treating her presence as temporary, her belongings as obstacles to be cleared away. It sent a wave of cold anger through her chest. She opened her door, facing Carter and his prospective tenants with steel in her spine. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying the precise tone she used in board meetings. "But this unit is not available, and I have documentation proving my right to be here." The couple looked between her and Carter, discomfort evident on their faces. Carter's expression darkened. But Mia held her ground, smartphone displaying her payment history like a shield. After an awkward moment, the couple mumbled excuses and retreated. Carter lingered, his attempt at intimidation undermined by the way Mia matched his stare. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning to leave. "You'll only make things harder for yourself." "No, Mr. Carter," Mia replied, her voice carrying down the hallway. "You're the one making things harder for yourself. I suggest you review fair housing laws before your next showing." She closed her door with deliberate calm, though her heart raced. Jennifer's approving smile helped steady her nerves. "That was amazing," Jennifer whispered. "But what now?" Mia looked at her phone, then at Jennifer's daughter, still coloring peacefully on her floor. The girl's future, along with every other resident's right to secure housing, now felt intertwined with her own fight for justice. She opened her contacts, scrolling to a number she hadn't used in weeks. Sometimes, she realized, the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. Mia sat in her father's study, surrounded by the familiar scent of leather-bound books and aged wood. Samuel Johnson's office hadn't changed since her childhood. The same imposing mahogany desk, the wall of industry awards discreetly placed to be visible, but not ostentatious. The photograph of her mother smiling down from behind his chair. What had changed was how Mia saw it all now, understanding the careful balance her father maintained between success and humility. Samuel listened intently as she recounted the confrontation with Carter, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The evening light cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines that years of navigating corporate America as a Black business owner had etched there. His silence spoke volumes. Mia recognized it as the same controlled response she'd learned to employ in her own professional battles. "I've documented everything," Mia continued, pulling out her tablet to show him the meticulously organized evidence. The payment records, the discriminatory patterns, the unauthorized apartment showings. "I've already contacted legal aid, but I wanted your advice before proceeding." She paused, watching her father's expression. "I know you always taught me to fight my own battles, but this feels bigger than just me." Samuel stood slowly, moving to the window that overlooked the city skyline. In the glass reflection, Mia caught a glimpse of something fierce in his eyes, a protective anger he rarely displayed. Sometimes," he said carefully. "Fighting your own battles means knowing when to deploy all your resources." He turned to face her, his usual reserved demeanor masking something else, something calculating. "Tell me more about the other tenants," he prompted, returning to his seat. "The ones Carter's targeting." As Mia described Jennifer's situation, Mrs. Chen's harassment, the Rodriguez family's struggles, she noticed her father taking notes, not on his computer or phone, but in the small leather notebook he reserved for his most important business dealings. "Did you know," Samuel began, his voice taking on the tone he used when sharing life lessons, "that I bought my first property 30 years ago? A small apartment building in a neighborhood no one else would invest in." He opened his desk drawer, removing a file that looked well-worn with age. The previous owner had been using discriminatory practices to keep certain families out. "I purchased it quietly, through a holding company, and turned it into a model of fair housing." Mia leaned forward, realization dawning. Her father had always been private about his business holdings, preferring to work behind the scenes. She knew he was successful, but the extent of his real estate investments had remained deliberately vague. "Dad," she started, a question forming in her mind. But Samuel held up a hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Your lease application went through standard channels," he explained. "I wanted you to secure your apartment on your own merits, to build your independence. But yes, I own the building." He paused, letting the information sink in. "And several others in the area, all managed through different companies to maintain privacy and prevent exactly the kind of preferential treatment you've always avoided." Mia sat back, processing this revelation. Part of her wanted to protest. She'd always prided herself on making her own way, on facing challenges head-on without relying on family connections. But another part recognized the strategic advantage this presented, not just for her, but for every resident facing Carter's discrimination. "What are you planning?" she asked, recognizing the look in her father's eyes, the same expression he wore when closing major deals or outmaneuvering hostile competitors. "You'll continue with legal aid," Samuel replied, reaching for his phone. "Document everything, support your neighbors, build your case. Meanwhile, I'll handle Carter through official channels. He doesn't know I'm the owner. That gives us an advantage." He began typing a message, his fingers moving with purpose. "Sometimes, Mia, the most effective strategy is letting your opponent underestimate you until it's too late." Mia watched her father work, understanding flowing between them. This wasn't about using privilege to escape problems. It was about utilizing every available tool to fight injustice, about turning Carter's own prejudices and assumptions against him. The quiet dignity with which her father handled his success had always inspired her. Now she was witnessing how that same dignity could become a weapon against discrimination. "Focus on your career," Samuel advised, his voice gentle but firm. "Be there for your neighbors. Let me handle the business side of this." He smiled, the expression both warm and determined. "Carter wants to clean up the building? Well, we'll certainly help him clean up his act, just not in the way he intended." As Mia left her father's office that evening, she felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at having such powerful support, determination to continue her own documentation efforts, and a deep appreciation for her father's strategic approach to fighting injustice. The weight of the eviction notice seemed lighter now, transformed from a threat into the first step of Carter's own undoing. The conference room at Johnson Holdings bore little resemblance to the worn office where Carter usually conducted his business. Gleaming mahogany tables reflected the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, while abstract art pieces adorned walls painted in subtle earth tones. The space radiated quiet power, designed to intimidate without being obvious about its intentions. Samuel Johnson sat at the head of the table, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, his presence commanding the room without a word. Two members of his legal team flanked him, their expressions professionally neutral as they reviewed documents spread before them. The room carried the weight of purpose, of carefully orchestrated consequences about to unfold. When Carter strutted through the door, his confidence was palpable. He wore what was clearly his best suit, though it paled in comparison to Samuel's bespoke attire, and carried a folder thick with what he presumably thought were impressive reports. The property manager's face betrayed no recognition of Samuel, no inkling that he was walking into anything more than a routine meeting with potential investors. "Mr. Carter," Samuel's assistant announced with practiced precision, "thank you for coming. Mr. Johnson would like to discuss your property management strategies." She closed the door with a soft click that somehow felt like a jail cell locking. Of course," Carter replied, settling into a chair with the easy manner of someone accustomed to selling his vision to superiors. "I've prepared a comprehensive overview of our upcoming improvements." He began spreading documents across the table, his enthusiasm evident. "We're implementing some exciting changes to attract a more desirable demographic." Samuel watched silently as Carter launched into his presentation, noting how the man's language grew bolder with each unchallenged statement. The property manager detailed his plans for upgrading the tenant profile, his voice carrying the casual prejudice of someone who had never faced consequences for his biases. "You see," Carter continued, warming to his subject, "certain elements have been holding back the building's potential. By weeding out problematic tenants, those who don't quite fit the professional image we're cultivating, we can significantly increase property values." He pulled out a spreadsheet with highlighted names. "I've already begun the process with several units." Samuel leaned forward slightly, his movement causing Carter to pause mid-sentence. "Tell me, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of boardroom authority. "How exactly do you determine which tenants are problematic?" Carter's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Well, it's all about maintaining standards. Take Unit 4A, for instance. The current tenant. He shuffled through his papers, not noticing how Samuel's eyes hardened at the mention of Mia's apartment. "Mia Johnson," Samuel supplied, his tone deceptively casual. "My daughter?" The color drained from Carter's face so rapidly it was almost comical. His hands froze over his documents, papers trembling slightly as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. "Your daughter?" he stammered, his previous confidence evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Yes," Samuel confirmed, now sliding forward a different set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of Johnson Holdings. "And I am not, as you seem to have assumed, a potential investor. I am the owner of the building you've been so zealously trying to clean up." The last two words carried all the weight of Carter's own prejudiced implications. Carter's attempt to backpedal was immediate and desperate. "Mr. Johnson, there must be some misunderstanding. The eviction notice was a clerical error. I had no idea." "That she was my daughter," Samuel interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Or that discriminatory housing practices are illegal regardless of who the tenant's father might be." He gestured to the lawyers beside him, who began producing more documents with practiced efficiency. "We've been monitoring your activities quite closely, Mr. Carter. The pattern of harassment, the targeted evictions, the unauthorized apartment showings, all meticulously documented." The room seemed to shrink around Carter as Samuel methodically laid out evidence of every discriminatory action, every biased decision, every violation of fair housing laws. The property manager's attempts to explain devolved into increasingly incoherent excuses about policy and standard procedures, each justification withering under Samuel's steady gaze. "I was just trying to increase property values," Carter finally managed, his voice small in the imposing space. "Everything was done according to policy." "Your policies," Samuel noted quietly, "seem remarkably selective in their application." He pushed forward one final document, a termination notice. "This meeting isn't about hearing your explanations, Mr. Carter. It's about informing you of the consequences of your actions." The termination notice lay between them like a drawn sword, its legal language stark against the polished mahogany. Carter's hands, usually so steady when wielding authority over tenants, trembled as he reached for the document. Samuel watched him with the patient attention of a man who had witnessed countless moments of realization, the instant when power dynamics shifted irrevocably. "Mr. Johnson," Carter began, his voice cracking slightly, "perhaps we could discuss this. I've maintained high occupancy rates, increased rental income." He trailed off as Samuel raised a hand, the gesture as final as a judge's gavel. "Let me be very clear about something," Samuel said, his tone carrying the weight of years of navigating systemic prejudice. "This isn't about property values or occupancy rates. This is about dignity. This is about people's homes." He opened a leather portfolio, revealing photographs of families Carter had targeted. Mrs. Chen tending her small balcony garden, the Rodriguez children playing in the courtyard, Jennifer Torres helping her daughter learn to walk. Each of these residents passed every legitimate screening requirement, Samuel continued. They pay their rent on time. They contribute to the community. The only reason they faced harassment under your management is because they don't fit your narrow vision of who deserves to live in this building. The lawyers flanking Samuel began outlining the legal implications of Carter's actions. Their voices filled the room with a litany of violations: discriminatory practices under the Fair Housing Act, illegal eviction attempts, harassment of protected classes. Each charge landed like a physical blow, stripping away Carter's professional facade to reveal the smallness beneath. "I didn't realize," Carter attempted, his words hollow even to his own ears. "The policies were meant to maintain standards." Samuel's laugh held no humor. "Standards?" He pulled out another document, Mia's perfect payment history, her professional credentials, her community involvement. My daughter exemplifies the highest standards of professionalism and character. Yet you tried to evict her based on nothing more than your own prejudices. Tell me, Mr. Carter, what standards exactly were you trying to maintain? Carter's attempt at an explanation died on his lips as Samuel continued, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a father protecting not just his child, but every resident who had faced similar discrimination. You had one responsibility: to manage this property fairly and professionally. Instead, you used your position to perpetuate the very kinds of discrimination that fair housing laws were created to prevent. Samuel gestured to the window, where the city sprawled below. Do you know why I bought this building? Because 30 years ago, people like you told people like me that certain neighborhoods weren't suitable for us, that we wouldn't fit in, that we needed to know our place. The silence that followed was deafening. Carter's face had taken on the sickly pallor of someone seeing their actions through new eyes, understanding too late the impact of their choices. Please, Carter whispered, desperation creeping into his voice. I have a family to support. If you could give me another chance, like the chances you gave Mrs. Chen when she asked for time to address your complaints, Samuel countered. Or the consideration you showed the Rodriguez family when you harassed them about visitors. Or the respect you offered my daughter when you tried to evict her without cause. The lawyers began sliding additional documents across the table. Severance papers conditional upon signing a non-disclosure agreement, agreements to waive legal claims, final accounting statements. The message was clear. This was not a negotiation, but a concluding ceremony. You'll receive 2 months' severance pay, Samuel stated, his tone businesslike. In return, you'll agree to never discuss the circumstances of your termination or contact any current or former tenants. You'll also undergo fair housing training before seeking any future property management positions. These terms are non-negotiable. Carter's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his situation settled over him. The power he had wielded so carelessly, the authority he had abused so freely, all of it stripped away by the very man whose daughter he had tried to displace. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so tragic. I'll need your keys and access cards before you leave, Samuel concluded, his voice softening slightly. Consider this an opportunity, Mr. Carter. An opportunity to learn from your mistakes and do better in the future. Not everyone gets that chance. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the conference room as Carter gathered his belongings. His movements were mechanical, his earlier confidence replaced by the heavy awareness of consequences finally catching up to actions. As he reached the door, Samuel's voice stopped him one final time. Remember this feeling, Mr. Carter. Remember what it's like to be judged not by your abilities or your character, but by someone else's prejudices. Maybe then, some good will come from all of this. The morning after Carter's dismissal, a subtle but profound change swept through the apartment building. The morning light seemed brighter somehow, filtering through the lobby windows and catching the dust motes that danced in the air. Maria, the longtime maintenance supervisor who Carter had repeatedly threatened with write-ups for speaking Spanish to residents, moved through the hallways with a lighter step, greeting residents with renewed warmth. Mia stood in her kitchen, preparing her morning coffee, when a knock at the door announced Jennifer Torres and her daughter. The toddler clutched a slightly crumpled drawing, proudly displaying it as soon as Mia opened the door. "For you," she announced, beaming. The crayon artwork showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of what appeared to be their building, a rainbow arching overhead. "We heard about Carter," Jennifer said softly, accepting the cup of coffee Mia offered. "The new property manager, Ms. Peterson, she already came by this morning. She apologized for everything and gave us her direct number in case we need anything." Jennifer's eyes glistened slightly. "Do you know how long it's been since someone in management treated me like a person instead of a problem?" The news spread through the building like a warm breeze, carrying with it stories of similar visits. Mrs. Chen called Mia, her voice trembling with emotion as she described how Ms. Peterson had expressed interest in her balcony garden, even suggesting they might start a community gardening program. The Rodriguez family reported that their relatives could now visit without suspicious scrutiny, their children free to play in the communal areas without fear of complaints. Samuel's influence, though largely unspoken, manifested in subtle but meaningful ways. The building's commons area, long neglected under Carter's management, underwent a thoughtful renovation. New plants appeared in the lobby, their care entrusted to Mrs. Chen's expert hands. The laundry room received new machines, and the security system was upgraded with cameras that made everyone feel safer rather than surveilled. One evening, as Mia returned from work, she found her father standing in the lobby, quietly observing the changes. His presence, normally so commanding in corporate settings, had softened to match the residential environment. He watched as the Rodriguez children helped Mrs. Chen water the new plants, their laughter echoing off the freshly painted walls. "You know," Samuel said as Mia approached, "when I bought this building, I had a vision, not of luxury apartments or exclusive addresses, but of a community where people could live with dignity, where their children could grow up feeling safe and valued." He gestured to the scene before them. "This is what real property value looks like." Ms. Peterson's management style emerged as the antithesis of Carter's. She organized monthly resident meetings, creating an open forum for concerns and suggestions. Maintenance requests were handled promptly and professionally, without the subtle discrimination that had marked Carter's tenure. The building's diverse population, once viewed as a problem to be solved, became celebrated as a strength. The transformation wasn't just physical. Residents who had once hurried through common areas, heads down to avoid confrontation, now lingered to chat. Children's artwork appeared on the community bulletin board alongside notices in multiple languages. The building's atmosphere shifted from one of tension and uncertainty to one of belonging and security. One Saturday morning, Mia found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a formal letter rescinding her eviction notice, accompanied by a personal note from Ms. Peterson, expressing the management's commitment to fair housing practices. Similar letters appeared under other doors throughout the building, each one helping to heal the wounds Carter's discrimination had inflicted. Samuel's words to her from that day in his office echoed in Mia's mind as she watched her home transform. Sometimes fighting your own battles means knowing when to deploy all your resources. The victory they'd achieved wasn't just about removing one prejudiced manager. It was about creating a model for what fair housing could and should be. That evening, as residents gathered for an impromptu celebration in the newly renovated community room, the sense of relief and joy was palpable. Mrs. Chen brought her famous dumplings, the Rodriguez family shared homemade tamales, and Jennifer's daughter toddled from person to person, collecting hugs and smiles. The building had become more than just a collection of apartments. It was a testament to the power of standing together against injustice, of transforming fear into hope. As Mia looked around at her neighbors, now free to truly make this space their home, she felt a deep sense of pride, not just in her father's actions, but in the resilience of every person who had faced discrimination yet refused to be diminished by it. The new lease on life wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about having a place to belong, to thrive, to build a future free from the shadow of prejudice. The community room buzzed with anticipation as residents filed in for the first official tenant meeting. Mia had spent the morning arranging chairs in a circle, deliberately breaking from the traditional rows that created artificial barriers between people. The space, once sterile and uninviting under Carter's management, now reflected the warmth of its occupants. Walls adorned with local artwork, potted plants from Mrs. Chen's collection, brightening corners, and a children's area thoughtfully stocked with books and quiet activities. Jennifer Torres arrived early, helping Mia set up refreshments while her daughter arranged cookies on plates with the serious concentration only a toddler could muster. The Rodriguez teenagers had volunteered to provide translation services, positioning themselves strategically around the room to ensure every voice could be heard. Mrs. Chen brought her famous jasmine tea, its delicate aroma mixing with the coffee brewing in the kitchen. "I never thought I'd see something like this," Jennifer whispered to Mia, watching as their neighbors filled the room. "Look at Mr. Patel from 3C actually talking to Mrs. Rodriguez about her empanada recipe. Last month, they barely made eye contact in the elevator." She paused, bouncing her daughter on her hip. "You know, when you first suggested this meeting, I worried no one would come, that the fear was too deep. But they had come." The room gradually filled with faces that had once hurried past each other in hallways, eyes that had once looked down now meeting with genuine interest. Even some of the older residents who rarely left their apartments had made an appearance, drawn by the promise of community and change. Mia stood at the center of the circle, her professional poise tempered by genuine warmth. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice carrying the same confidence she used in corporate presentations, but softened with understanding. "We're here today not just to discuss building matters, but to rebuild trust, to ensure that what happened under previous management never happens again." The stories began slowly at first, like water trickling through a dam. Mrs. Chen spoke of the years she'd spent afraid to cook her traditional dishes, fearing complaints. The Rodriguez family shared how they'd stopped hosting family gatherings, their children's birthday parties reduced to whispered celebrations. Each account unleashed more, the room filling with shared experiences of discrimination, masked as policy. But alongside the pain came hope. Residents began offering solutions, suggestions for building a stronger community. Someone proposed a monthly cultural exchange dinner. Another suggested creating a residents' council to work directly with management. The teenagers volunteered to help elderly neighbors with technology and errands. Ms. Peterson, the new property manager, took notes diligently, her presence a stark contrast to Carter's authoritarian style. She shared plans for upcoming improvements, but more importantly, she listened. When concerns were raised, she addressed them directly, without dismissal or deflection. Mia found herself deeply moved by the transformation unfolding before her. This wasn't just about housing rights anymore. It was about human dignity, about creating a space where diversity was celebrated rather than tolerated. She thought of her father's words about property values and realized that true value lay in these connections, these moments of shared understanding. After the meeting, as residents lingered over refreshments and conversation, Mia retreated to a quiet corner to collect her thoughts. A legal aid attorney had approached her during the discussion, inviting her to speak at upcoming housing rights workshops. The prospect of sharing their story, of helping other communities fight discrimination, stirred something deep within her. Her father appeared beside her, having slipped in quietly during the meeting. "You've started something important here," he said softly, watching the animated discussions continuing around the room. "This is how real change happens, not just through legal victories, but through community building." Mia nodded, understanding flowing between them. "I've been thinking," she began, "about expanding this, creating a network of tenant advocates, sharing resources and strategies. What happened here? It's happening everywhere, isn't it?" Samuel's proud smile answered her question. "And now you have a platform to fight it." Sometimes the best response to discrimination isn't just winning your own battle, it's helping others fight theirs. As the evening wound down, Mia watched Jennifer's daughter falling asleep in her mother's arms, Mrs. Chen teaching Mrs. Rodriguez the proper way to steep jasmine tea, and the teenagers planning a tutoring program for younger residents. The building had become more than a collection of apartments. It was a living testament to resilience, to the power of standing together against injustice. Walking back to her apartment that night, Mia felt a profound sense of purpose. The eviction notice that had once threatened to uproot her life had instead planted seeds of change. Tomorrow, she would begin reaching out to other communities, sharing their story, building networks of support. The fight against housing discrimination wouldn't end with their building. but it had shown her what was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Her home, once a battlefield, had become a beacon of hope, and Mia was ready to carry that light forward, illuminating the path for others facing similar struggles, knowing that every small victory against discrimination helped build a world where everyone could find their place to belong.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.